Hi, I'm Greg. Welcome to Affect Studio, and welcome to part 2 of listing the different circuit topologies in the same amp. I thought it'd be interesting to hear the changes in the amp using a different cab. I'll also change guitars in a moment. So that's fixed bias with negative feedback on. This is cathode bias. And back to fixed bias. Okay, so this is fixed bias with negative feedback off. So you can really hear how much the negative feedback cuts out the signal, the overall volume. Negative feedback back on. Okay, this is cathode bias with negative feedback. Okay, cathode bias without negative feedback. Okay, negative feedback back on. I'm running the amp into the cab of my Tweed Vibrolux style amp with a 10-inch Eminence Legend 1028K Alico speaker. As you'll know if you've experimented with swapping cabs or watched any of my videos on cabs and speakers, the cab shapes the sound more than any other part of the amp. Okay, that's cathode bias with negative feedback on. This is fixed bias. Back to cathode bias. Okay, that's cathode bias. This is with the negative feedback off. Okay, negative feedback back on, still with cathode biasing. Okay, I'm going back to fixed bias with the negative feedback off. And this is fixed bias with the negative feedback back on. Tweed cabs are very different to the Marshall quad I used last time. The baffle is only attached by the 4 screws you see at the top and bottom, so it's essentially floating. Okay, let's turn the volume right up, cut out the middleman. So that is fixed bias with negative feedback on. This is negative feedback off, still with fixed bias. You hear the sound doesn't change as much there, it just gets slightly more gritty and distorted because it's already at the full volume. Okay, so this is cathode bias with the negative feedback off. Cathode bias with negative feedback on. Okay, cathode with negative feedback off again. Okay, and back to fixed bias with no negative feedback. Okay, fixed bias with negative feedback on. Okay, let's set it down a little bit. Okay, it's fixed bias with a negative feedback on. This is cathode bias. Okay, back to fixed bias. Okay, fixed bias with negative feedback off. Okay, cathode bias with negative feedback off. Okay, it's cathode bias with negative feedback on. So that's it. If I didn't know, I would have said it was a completely different amp, which basically it is. We're hearing way more of the Tweed characteristics due to the cab. And in fact, you can hear that the cab is not really coping with the low end with its floating baffle compared to the quad we heard in the last video. Leo Fender used all those circuit variations into Tweed amps, so that could almost be a Tweed sampler. So I hope this has been enlightening. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Hit the drop down menu on the subscribe thing and hit the bell notification so you get a message when I post a new video. And hopefully I'll see you soon.